The dust had barely settled on Florence Kendrick's mother's grave when the bank came to take the house, and she found herself standing in the middle of Tulsa, Oklahoma territory, with nothing but a carpet bag full of embroidered linens and the clothes on her back. It was August of 1891, and the heat pressed down on her like a physical weight as she walked along the rough wooden sidewalks, trying to decide whether to cry or scream or simply lie down in the dirt and give up entirely. She was 22 years old, alone for the first time in her life, and terrified in a way that made her bones feel hollow. The town sprawled around her in shades of brown and gray, buildings thrown up hastily in the land rush just 2 years prior, still raw and unfinished looking. Men on horseback kicked up clouds of red dust as they rode past, and somewhere a piano played badly in what she assumed was a saloon. She had never been in a place like this, never been anywhere really except the small farm where she had grown up and cared for her ailing mother for the past 4 years. Now that farm belonged to the bank, and Florence belonged nowhere. She stopped outside a general store, setting down her carpet bag to catch her breath. Inside, through the wavy glass window, she could see women examining bolts of fabric, living their ordinary lives. Florence reached into her bag and pulled out one of her mother's handkerchiefs, the one with the tiny roses embroidered in the corners. Her mother had taught her to stitch before she could properly read, and Florence's fingers knew the language of needle and thread better than anything else. She had spent long nights at her mother's bedside, working by lamplight, creating beautiful things while everything around her fell apart. An idea formed, desperate and half-formed. She could sell these. She had to sell these. There was nothing else. Florence gathered her courage and her carpet bag and pushed through the door of the general store. The woman behind the counter looked her up and down with sharp eyes, taking in the dusty traveling dress and the carpet bag that had seen better days. "Help you?" the woman asked, not unkindly but not warmly either. "I have embroidered goods," Florence said, forcing her voice to sound steadier than she felt. "Handkerchiefs, tablecloths, pillowcases, very fine work. I thought perhaps you might be interested in purchasing them or allowing me to sell them here on consignment." The woman's expression softened slightly. "Let me see." Florence opened her bag and spread several pieces on the counter. They were beautiful, truly beautiful, each stitch perfect and even, the designs ranging from simple flowers to elaborate scenes of birds and vines. The woman touched them carefully, holding up a tablecloth to examine it in the light from the window. "These are mighty fine," she admitted. "But I cannot afford to buy them outright, and we do not do consignment here. You might try the hotel or perhaps go door to door. Plenty of new wives in town who might want to fancy up their homes." Florence felt her hope deflating but forced herself to smile. "Thank you for your time." She spent the rest of the afternoon walking up and down the streets of Tulsa, knocking on doors, showing her embroidery to anyone who would look. Some women admired the work, but said they had no money for such luxuries. Others barely glanced at it before shutting the door. By the time the sun started sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Florence had sold exactly one handkerchief for 25 cents. It was not enough for a room at the hotel. It was not enough for anything. She found herself on the outskirts of town, near a cluster of houses and small ranches that spread out into the endless prairie. Her feet hurt, her throat was dry, and she was trying very hard not to think about what would happen when darkness fell. She had never spent a night outdoors in her life. A house stood apart from the others, small and tidy with a barn behind it and a corral where several horses stood swishing their tails in the heat. Smoke rose from the chimney despite the warm evening, and Florence could smell something cooking. Her stomach cramped with hunger. She had not eaten since the previous evening, a piece of bread she had saved from the train. She walked up to the door before she could lose her nerve and knocked firmly 3 times. The man who answered was tall and lean, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of a winter sky. He wore work clothes, dusty and worn, and there was surprise on his face at finding a woman standing on his doorstep. "Yes," he said, and his voice was deep, a little rough. "I am sorry to bother you," Florence said quickly. "My name is Florence Kendrick and I am selling embroidered goods. Very fine work. I have handkerchiefs, tablecloths, pillowcases. I thought perhaps you might be interested or know someone who might be." He looked at her for a long moment, and Florence felt her cheeks warming under his gaze. She suddenly became aware of how she must look, dusty and tired and desperate. "I am not married," he said finally. "I have no use for embroidered things." "Oh," Florence said, and the disappointment must have shown on her face because he did not immediately close the door. "You look worn out," he said. "When did you last eat?" The question startled her. "I am fine, thank you." "That is not what I asked." Florence lifted her chin, trying to hold onto her dignity. "Yesterday evening." He studied her face, then stepped back from the door. "Come in. I have stew on the stove. You can eat something before you go back to town." "I could not possibly impose," Florence said, even as her stomach betrayed her with a loud growl. "It is no imposition. I made too much anyway." He gestured toward the interior of the house. "Come on. No sense standing there arguing about it." Florence hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. The house was simple but clean. One main room with a kitchen area, a table and chairs, and a fireplace where a pot hung over low flames. A doorway led to what she assumed was a bedroom. Everything was neat and orderly, but there was a loneliness to the space, a sense of a life lived in solitude. "Sit," the man said, pointing to the table. "I am Quinn Fitzgerald, by the way." "Florence Kendrick," she said again, settling carefully onto one of the chairs. Quinn ladled stew into a bowl and set it in front of her along with a chunk of bread. The smell made her dizzy with hunger, but she tried to eat slowly, tried to maintain some semblance of manners. Quinn sat down across from her with his own bowl and ate in silence, occasionally glancing at her. "You are new to Tulsa," he said after a while. It was not a question. "I arrived this morning. My mother passed away 2 weeks ago and the bank took our farm. I had nowhere else to go, so I came here hoping to make a living with my embroidery work." "That is a hard way to make a living," Quinn said. "It is the only skill I have." He studied her over his bowl, those winter sky eyes thoughtful. "Where are you staying?" Florence focused very hard on her stew. "I have not secured lodgings yet. I was hoping to make more sales today." "How much did you make?" 25 cents. Quinn was quiet for a moment. "The hotel is $2 a night, I am aware." "Do you know anyone in Tulsa?" "No." He set down his spoon and leaned back in his chair, regarding her seriously. "Miss Kendrick, I do not mean to be indelicate, but you understand that you cannot sleep on the street. This is a rough town, especially for a woman alone." "I will manage," Florence said, trying to sound confident. How, she had no answer for that. She stared down at her bowl, feeling tears threatening to spill over. She would not cry in front of this stranger. She would not. Quinn sighed. "Let me see your embroidery." Florence looked up, confused. "What, your embroidery? Let me see it." She pulled her carpetbag onto her lap and carefully removed the pieces, spreading them across the table. Quinn examined each one carefully, running his rough fingers over the delicate stitching. He held up a pillowcase embroidered with a scene of horses running across a prairie, the detail so fine that each individual blade of grass was visible. "These are beautiful," he said quietly. "Really beautiful. My mother used to do embroidery, not as fine as this, but she loved it." She passed away 3 years ago." "I am sorry," Florence said softly. Quinn set down the pillowcase and looked at her directly. "I am going to make you a business proposition, Miss Kendrick, and I want you to hear me out before you say no." Florence's heart started beating faster. "All right." "I need a wife," Quinn said bluntly. "I have been trying to build up this ranch for the past 5 years, ever since I came to Oklahoma Territory. It is hard work doing it alone, and I am lonely. I am not going to lie about that. I am 28 years old, and I am tired of coming home to an empty house." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You need a home and a way to survive. I am proposing a marriage of convenience. You would have a roof over your head, food to eat, and security. In return, you would keep house and cook. If you wanted to continue your embroidery work, you could do that too. I would not stop you." Florence stared at him, unable to find words. She had heard of such arrangements, of course, especially out here on the frontier where women were scarce and life was hard, but she had never imagined herself in such a situation. "I know this is sudden," Quinn continued, "and I know you do not know me at all. I am not asking you to love me or anything like that. Just a practical arrangement between two people who could help each other out. I am a decent man, Miss Kendrick. I do not drink to excess, I do not gamble, and I would treat you with respect. You would have your own room if you wanted it. I would not force anything on you." "I do not understand," Florence said slowly. "Why would you propose marriage to a complete stranger?" "Because you need help and I need a partner," Quinn said simply. "And because I look at you and I see someone strong enough to walk around a strange town all day trying to sell handkerchiefs rather than give up. That is the kind of person I want beside me." Florence looked down at her hands, at the calluses on her fingertips from years of needlework. This was insane. She could not possibly agree to marry a man she had met 20 minutes ago. It was reckless and foolish and desperate, but what was the alternative? She had 25 cents to her name and nowhere to sleep tonight. She could try to find work as a maid or a laundress, but that would take time, and in the meanwhile, she would be vulnerable and alone. She thought about her mother, about the promises she had made at the graveside to survive, to build a life, to not let everything they had worked for turn to dust. "If I agreed," she said carefully, "and I am not saying I am agreeing, but if I did, what exactly would you expect from me?" Quinn seemed to relax slightly, as if he had been braced for an immediate refusal. "Cooking, cleaning, mending. Help with the garden if you are willing. I run a small ranch, about 200 acres, with cattle and horses. I do most of that work myself, but an extra pair of hands is always useful if you wanted to learn. Like I said, you would have your own space, your own privacy. We would get to know each other properly before anything else. And if we found we could not stand each other, then we would figure that out when we came to it. But Miss Kendrick, I am a straightforward man. I do not play games and I do not have a temper. I think we could at least be civil to each other, and that is more than a lot of married folks can say." Florence looked around the small, neat house, then back at Quinn's face. There was honesty there, she thought, and loneliness that matched her own. He was not offering her romance or passion or any of the things young girls dreamed about, but he was offering her safety and a purpose, and right now that seemed more precious than any dream. "All right," she heard herself say. "I will marry you." Quinn's eyes widened slightly, as if he had not actually expected her to agree. "Truly, truly. But I want to be clear, Mr. Fitzgerald, that I expect to be treated with respect and dignity. I may be agreeing to this out of necessity, but I am not agreeing to be mistreated." "You have my word," Quinn said solemnly. "I will treat you with all the respect you deserve." They were married 3 days later by the traveling preacher who came through Tulsa once a month. Florence wore her best dress, which was still dusty from travel, and Quinn wore a clean shirt and had shaved carefully. They stood in the small church with two witnesses pulled in from the street, and Florence repeated vows she had never imagined saying to a man she barely knew. Quinn slipped a simple gold band on her finger, and when the preacher told him to kiss his bride, he leaned forward and pressed a chaste, brief kiss to her lips. Florence felt her face flush hot, and when she looked up at him, she saw that his neck had gone red above his collar. They walked back to the ranch together, Quinn leading his horse while Florence rode, her carpetbag tied behind the saddle. Neither of them spoke much. What was there to say? They had made a practical arrangement, a business deal dressed up in wedding vows. When they arrived at the house, Quinn helped her down from the horse and carried her bag inside. He set it down in the main room and then stood there looking awkward, as if he had run out of script and did not know what came next. "Let me show you where everything is," he said finally. "The bedroom through that door is yours now. I will sleep out here." "You do not have to do that," Florence said. "This is your home. I can sleep out here." "Absolutely not. You are my wife. You get the bedroom." Florence wanted to argue, but she was too tired. She nodded and followed him through the door into a small room with a single bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out toward the prairie. It was simple but clean, and the bed had a quilt on it that looked handmade, the stitching careful if not expert. "My mother made that," Quinn said, following her gaze. "She was working on it when she got sick. I finished it after she passed. It is not very good." Florence touched the quilt gently. The stitches were indeed uneven, but there was something touching about the image of this large, rough cowboy trying to finish his mother's final project. "It is lovely," she said softly. Quinn cleared his throat. "Well, I will let you settle in. There is water in the basin for washing. Supper is usually around 6 if you are hungry." After he left, closing the door softly behind him, Florence sat down on the bed and finally let herself cry. She cried for her mother, for her lost home, for the strangeness of everything that had happened in the last few weeks. She cried for her lost innocence, for the girl she had been who believed life would be simple and good. And then, when the tears finally stopped, she washed her face in the basin and began to unpack her meager belongings. This was her life now. She was Florence Fitzgerald, wife to a cowboy she did not know, living in a small house on the Oklahoma prairie. There was no use crying about it anymore. She had made her choice and now she had to live with it. The first weeks of marriage were awkward and strange, like learning to dance with someone when neither of you knew the steps. Florence woke early each morning to find Quinn already gone, out tending to the cattle and horses. She would make breakfast and leave it warming on the stove for when he came back, then spend her day cleaning and organizing the house. There was a lot to organize. Quinn had been living alone for 3 years, and while he kept things generally tidy, there was a bachelor quality to everything. Dishes were stacked haphazardly, clothes needed mending, and the garden was overgrown with weeds. Florence threw herself into the work, grateful to have something to occupy her hands and mind. In the evenings, they would sit together at the table and eat the meals she prepared. Quinn always complimented her cooking, even when she burned things or oversalted them as she adjusted to the wood stove. They would talk about safe, impersonal things: the weather, the cattle, the news from town. They were polite to each other, carefully polite, like strangers sharing a stagecoach. At night, Quinn would make up a bedroll near the fireplace while Florence retreated to the bedroom. She would lie awake listening to him moving around in the other room, aware of him in a way that made her uncomfortable. He was her husband in name, but he was still a stranger, and she did not know how to bridge that gap. 2 weeks after the wedding, Florence was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard a commotion from the barn. She dropped the wet shirt she was holding and hurried toward the noise, her heart pounding. Quinn was in the corral with one of the horses, a large chestnut stallion that was rearing and thrashing wildly. Quinn was trying to calm the animal, his voice low and steady, but the horse was panicked about something. Florence climbed up on the fence to get a better look and immediately saw the problem. The horse had gotten a piece of barbed wire tangled around its back leg, and every time it moved, the wire cut deeper into its flesh. "Quinn," she called. "Its leg, there is wire." Quinn saw it immediately. He approached the horse carefully, still speaking in that low, calm voice, and managed to get close enough to grab the halter. The horse tossed its head, eyes rolling white with fear, but Quinn held on. "I need you to come in here," Quinn called to Florence. "I need you to cut the wire while I hold him." Florence did not hesitate. She climbed over the fence and into the corral, her skirts tangling around her legs. Quinn directed her to the toolbox by the barn, and she found wire cutters, then hurried back. "Be careful," Quinn said as she approached the horse. "Stay to the side. If he kicks, I do not want him hitting you." Florence knelt in the dirt beside the horse's injured leg. The animal was trembling, sweat darkening its coat, but Quinn kept talking to it, kept holding its head steady. Florence carefully worked the wire cutters into position and began cutting through the barbed wire strand by strand. Blood ran down the horse's leg, matting the hair, and she could see the deep cuts the wire had made. "Almost there," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. "Just one more." The last strand snapped and Florence pulled the wire away, tossing it clear of the corral. Quinn released the horse, and it immediately bolted to the far side of the enclosure, limping heavily on the injured leg. "We need to clean that wound and wrap it," Quinn said, breathing hard. "If it gets infected, we might lose him." They spent the next hour coaxing the horse close enough to treat the injury. Florence held the halter while Quinn cleaned the wounds with water and iodine, then wrapped the leg in clean bandages. The horse flinched and snorted but seemed to understand they were helping. When it was finally done, both of them were sweating and exhausted. They leaned against the fence, watching the horse move slowly around the corral, testing the bandaged leg. "Thank you," Quinn said, turning to look at Florence. "You did well. A lot of women would have been too frightened to come into the corral." "I grew up on a farm," Florence said. "I am not afraid of animals. Still, I appreciate it." He paused, then added, "We make a good team." Florence looked at him, really looked at him, maybe for the first time since they had married. His face was tired and streaked with dirt, his shirt soaked through with sweat. But there was something in his expression, something warm and genuine that made her heart skip a beat. "Yes," she said softly, "I suppose we do." Something shifted between them that day. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. They started talking more at dinner, real conversations instead of polite small talk. Quinn told her about growing up in Missouri, about coming west after his father died to make a new start. Florence talked about her mother, about the long years of illness, about the embroidery they had done together by lamplight. One evening, about a month after the wedding, Quinn came in from the barn carrying a wooden crate. He set it on the table with a shy smile. "I got you something in town today," he said. Florence set down the dish she was washing and came over to look. Inside the crate were spools of embroidery thread in every color imaginable, needles of various sizes, and several yards of fine linen. "Quinn," she breathed, touching the thread with trembling fingers. "This must have cost a fortune." "You have been talking about wanting to do your embroidery work," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "I thought you should have proper supplies. Maybe you could make things to sell at the general store like you were planning before." Florence felt tears pricking at her eyes. It was the first gift anyone had given her in years, and the thoughtfulness of it overwhelmed her. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much." She worked on her embroidery in the evenings after supper, sitting in the chair by the fireplace while Quinn read the newspaper or mended tack. Sometimes he would watch her work, fascinated by the way her needle flashed in and out of the fabric, creating images from colored thread. "How do you do that?" he asked one night as she worked on a pillowcase decorated with prairie flowers. "How do you know where to put each stitch?" "I do not really think about it," Florence said. "My hands just know." "My mother used to say embroidery was like telling a story with thread instead of words." "What story is this one telling?" Florence held up the pillowcase, examining her work. "It is telling the story of this place. These are the flowers I see when I walk out to the garden every morning. The sunflowers by the fence, the wild roses growing near the creek, the Indian paintbrush in the far pasture. It is the story of my new home." Quinn was quiet for a long moment. "Is it home now?" he asked softly. "For you?" Florence met his eyes across the room. "Yes," she said, and realized it was true. "Yes, I think it is." As summer turned to fall, Florence settled more fully into her role as Quinn's wife. She learned to milk the cow, to gather eggs from the chickens, to tell when bread dough had risen enough. She planted a winter garden with cabbage and turnips and carrots. She mended all of Quinn's clothes and made curtains for the windows from fabric she bought with the money from selling her embroidery at the general store. And slowly, carefully, she and Quinn learned each other. She learned that he always woke before dawn, that he liked his coffee black and strong, that he had a fear of thunderstorms that he tried to hide. She learned that he sang when he thought no one could hear him, old songs his mother had taught him, and that he had a scar on his left shoulder from a fall when he was learning to ride. He learned that she was afraid of the dark, that she had nightmares about her mother's final days, that she hummed while she cooked. He learned that she had never learned to shoot a gun or ride a horse properly, and he set about teaching her both with a patience that surprised them both. "You need to be able to protect yourself out here," he said one afternoon, as he showed her how to load and fire his rifle. "And you need to be able to ride in case of emergency." Florence proved to be a decent shot, but a terrible rider. The horse always seemed to know she was nervous and would take advantage, going wherever it pleased instead of where she directed. "Stop being afraid," Quinn said, laughing as her horse veered off toward the creek again. "He can sense it." "I am not afraid," Florence insisted, even though she was. Quinn rode up beside her and reached over to take her horse's reins. "Here, let me help." He guided both horses in a slow circle, his leg occasionally brushing against hers. Florence was acutely aware of his nearness, of his hand so close to hers on the reins. She found herself watching the way he sat the horse so easily, like he had been born to it, and something warm and unfamiliar stirred in her chest. She was developing feelings for her husband, she realized with a start. Real feelings, not just gratitude or companionship. She liked the way he smiled when he thought she had made a joke, liked the sound of his voice in the morning when he was still half asleep, liked the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not paying attention. It terrified her. One evening in late October, a cold wind swept across the prairie, bringing the smell of distant snow. Florence made stew for dinner and biscuits, and they ate together by the fire as the wind rattled the windows. Quinn had been quieter than usual all day, and Florence could tell something was bothering him. "Is everything all right?" she asked finally, setting down her bowl. Quinn looked at her, then away, then back again. "Florence," he said, and the use of her first name startled her. He usually called her Miss Florence or Mrs. Fitzgerald, maintaining that careful formality between them. "I need to tell you something." Her heart started beating faster. "What is it?" "I have been thinking about our arrangement," he said slowly. "About our marriage. When I proposed to you, I said it would be practical, that I would not expect anything from you except housekeeping and companionship. And I have tried to honor that. But Florence, these past months, getting to know you, seeing you here in my home, our home, I have to be honest with you." He paused, clearly struggling with the words. Florence waited, barely breathing. "I have developed feelings for you," Quinn said finally, the words coming out in a rush. "Real feelings. I care about you more than I expected to, more than I probably should. I know that was not part of our arrangement. I know you married me out of necessity and not affection, but I needed you to know the truth. I needed to be honest." Florence stared at him, her mind spinning. "Quinn, you do not have to say anything," he said quickly. "I am not asking you to feel the same way. I just could not keep pretending anymore. Could not keep treating you like a business partner when every time I look at you I feel—" He broke off, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I am making a mess of this." "No," Florence said softly. "No, you are not." She stood up from her chair and crossed the small distance between them. Quinn watched her approach with something like fear in his eyes, as if he expected her to reject him, to be angry or disgusted. Instead, she reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I have feelings for you too," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have been trying to ignore them, trying to tell myself it was just gratitude or convenience. But it is not. Quinn, you have been so kind to me, so patient. You gave me a home when I had nothing. You have never made me feel like a burden or an obligation. And somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking of you as the stranger I married and started thinking of you as my husband. My real husband." Quinn stood slowly, his hand tightening around hers. "Florence," he said again, and this time her name sounded like a prayer. He cupped her face with his free hand, his thumb brushing across her cheek. "May I kiss you, properly this time?" "Yes," Florence breathed. He kissed her slowly, carefully, as if she were something precious that might break. Florence rose up on her toes, her arms going around his neck, and kissed him back with all the feelings she had been holding inside. It was nothing like the brief, awkward kiss at their wedding. This was real and warm and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. Quinn rested his forehead against hers. "I want this to be a real marriage," he said quietly. "If you want that too, I want us to be real partners, real husband and wife in every way, but only if that is what you want. I will never force you. I want that," Florence said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I want that more than anything." That night, the wall between them finally came down. They came together tentatively at first, then with growing confidence, learning each other in a new and intimate way. Quinn was gentle and patient, and Florence felt any lingering fear or hesitation melt away in the warmth of his touch. Afterwards, they lay together in the bed that had been hers alone, Quinn's arm around her shoulders, her head on his chest. She could hear his heartbeat, strong and steady, and for the first time since her mother died, Florence felt truly safe. "I love you," Quinn said into the darkness. "I know it might be too soon to say it, but I do. I love you, Florence." "I love you too," she whispered back, and knew it was true. The winter that followed was hard, as winters on the prairie always were. Snow piled up against the house and wind howled across the frozen ground. But inside, Florence and Quinn built a life together, a real life, full of warmth and laughter and love. They spent long evenings by the fire, Florence working on her embroidery while Quinn read aloud from the books he had bought in town. They told each other stories about their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. They learned to argue constructively when they disagreed, and to make up thoroughly afterwards. Quinn taught Florence to play checkers, and she taught him some of the songs her mother had sung. On especially cold nights, they would push the furniture aside and dance awkwardly around the small room, making up their own steps and laughing at their mistakes. Florence's embroidery business grew steadily. The general store could not keep her pieces in stock, and women started coming to the ranch directly to commission special items. She embroidered wedding presents and baby blankets, tablecloths and handkerchiefs, each piece a tiny work of art. The money she earned she saved carefully, thinking of the future, of the family she and Quinn wanted to build. In the spring, as the prairie exploded with wildflowers and new grass, Florence discovered she was pregnant. She told Quinn one evening after supper, nervous about his reaction. They had talked about children, but always as something far in the future. Quinn's face went through a series of expressions: shock, joy, fear, and then joy again. "Truly," he asked, his voice hoarse, "truly, I think the baby will come in early October." He swept her up in his arms, spinning her around despite her laughing protests. "We are going to be parents," he said wonderingly. "Florence, we are going to have a baby." "We need to prepare," Florence said, her practical nature asserting itself even through her happiness. "We will need a cradle and baby clothes and so many things." "We will get everything," Quinn promised. "I will take care of you, both of you, I swear it." He was true to his word. He built a beautiful cradle from oak wood, sanding it smooth so there would be no splinters to catch tiny skin. He added a room onto the house, a proper nursery with a window facing east to catch the morning light. He rode to town every week to bring back whatever Florence wanted, no matter how unusual the request. Florence sewed tiny clothes and embroidered blankets, her stitches even tinier than usual to match the small person who would use them. She chose designs of horses and cattle, prairie flowers and wide skies, wanting her child to know from the beginning that they were part of this land, this life. As summer wore on and Florence grew rounder, Quinn became increasingly protective. He would not let her lift anything heavy or work too long in the garden. He worried constantly that she was overdoing it, that something would go wrong. "I am pregnant, not ill," Florence told him one afternoon when he had gently but firmly taken the laundry basket from her hands. "Women have been having babies forever. I will be fine." "I know," Quinn said, "but you are my wife and that is my child you are carrying, and I am going to worry." "That is my job." Florence softened, reaching up to cup his face. "I love you," she said simply. "I love you too, both of you." In early October, 2 days before Florence's 23rd birthday, the pain started. Quinn rode to town in record time to fetch the doctor and the midwife, then paced the main room while Florence labored in the bedroom. It was a long night, filled with sounds that made Quinn's heart clench with fear and helplessness. But when dawn broke pink and gold across the prairie, his son was born. The midwife brought the baby out, cleaned and wrapped in one of Florence's embroidered blankets. "You have a healthy boy," she said with a smile, "and your wife did wonderfully. She is tired but fine." Quinn took the baby with trembling hands, staring down at the tiny face, the little hands that waved aimlessly in the air. His son. He had a son. "Can I see Florence?" he asked, unable to take his eyes off the baby. "Of course. She has been asking for you." Florence was propped up against the pillows, looking exhausted but radiant. Her face lit up when Quinn came in carrying their son. "Come meet your mother," Quinn said softly, settling the baby into Florence's arms. "She is the strongest, bravest person I know." Florence looked down at their son, tears streaming down her face. "He is perfect," she whispered. "Quinn, look what we made." "What should we name him?" Quinn asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. They had discussed names for months, arguing good-naturedly about family names and meanings. But looking at their son now, Florence knew exactly what his name should be. Thomas, she said. Thomas Quinn Fitzgerald, after your father. Quinn's eyes filled with tears. His father had died when he was 16, and they had parted after an argument Quinn had never had the chance to resolve. Naming his son after him felt like a gift, like forgiveness for old wounds. Thomas, he repeated. Yes, that is perfect. They sat together in the early morning light, the three of them, and Florence thought about the journey that had brought her here. A year ago, she had been alone and desperate, knocking on doors trying to sell embroidered handkerchiefs. Now she had a husband who loved her, a son in her arms, and a home that was truly hers. "What are you thinking?" Quinn asked, stroking the baby's soft hair. "I am thinking about embroidery," Florence said. "About how separate threads can look like nothing much, just colors and texture. But when you stitch them together in the right pattern, they become something beautiful, something whole." Quinn smiled, understanding. "Like us." "Like us," Florence agreed. Thomas grew quickly, a healthy, happy baby who filled the house with his cries and gurgles and, eventually, laughter. Quinn was a devoted father, carrying his son everywhere, pointing out horses and cattle and clouds, talking to him as if he could understand every word. Florence divided her time between caring for Thomas and continuing her embroidery work. She had more commissions than she could handle, and women came from as far as Tulsa to buy her pieces. The extra money allowed them to buy more cattle, to improve the ranch, to build toward a more secure future. On their first wedding anniversary, Quinn brought home a surprise. He led Florence outside to find a brand-new buckboard wagon with a matched pair of horses. "I know you still are not comfortable riding," he said. "And I thought it would be easier for you to get to town with Thomas if you had a wagon." Florence threw her arms around him, overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness. "It is perfect. You are perfect." "I am far from perfect," Quinn said with a laugh, "but I try my best for you." They loaded Thomas into the wagon and drove into Tulsa together, a family outing. People waved as they passed, calling greetings. Florence realized with a start that she was no longer the desperate stranger who had arrived a year ago. She was Mrs. Fitzgerald, Quinn's wife, a respected member of the community. At the general store, the proprietor's wife made a fuss over Thomas and asked Florence about her latest embroidery projects. At the bank, the manager tipped his hat respectfully. Florence was building a reputation, a name, a life. That afternoon, as they drove back to the ranch with Thomas asleep in Florence's arms, Quinn reached over and took her free hand. "Happy anniversary," he said. "Happy anniversary. I love you." "I love you too. Thank you for taking a chance on a lonely cowboy." Florence smiled, remembering that day a year ago when she had stood on his doorstep offering embroidery. "Thank you for buying it," she said. "For buying the embroidery and asking me to stitch our lives together." "Best purchase I ever made," Quinn said, grinning. The years that followed were good ones, filled with the ordinary joys and struggles of life. The ranch prospered, growing from 200 acres to nearly 500. Quinn hired help during busy seasons, and Florence became known throughout the territory for her embroidery work. Her pieces were sold as far away as Kansas City and St. Louis, each one signed with her initials in tiny stitches. Thomas grew into a sturdy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's blue eyes. He followed Quinn everywhere, learning to ride almost before he could walk, chattering constantly about horses and cattle and the big prairie sky. When Thomas was 3, Florence gave birth to a daughter they named Lily Rose. She was tiny and delicate, with blonde curls and a sweet disposition. Quinn absolutely doted on her, and it was a common sight to see the rough cowboy carrying his tiny daughter around on his shoulders, her laughter ringing out across the ranch. 2 years later came another son, James, who seemed to be born running. He was into everything, fearless and curious, keeping Florence constantly on her toes. Quinn built a bigger fence around the yard to keep James from wandering off toward the creek or the cattle pens. Their house grew along with their family, rooms added as needed, always a project in progress. Florence embroidered curtains for every room, made quilts for every bed, stitched samplers with Bible verses and family sayings to hang on the walls. The house became a testament to her skill and her love, every corner touched by her art. On their 5th anniversary, Quinn gave Florence a beautiful wooden chest he had made himself, perfectly sized to hold all her embroidery supplies. On the lid, he had carved a scene of a woman at a doorstep, offering something to a man, and the man reaching out to take it. "It is us," Florence said, running her fingers over the carving. "That first day." "I wanted you to have something to remind you," Quinn said. "Not that you were desperate and I was lonely, but that we found each other, that we took a chance." Florence set the chest down carefully and wrapped her arms around her husband. At 27 years old, she had 3 beautiful children, a thriving business, and a marriage that was stronger and deeper than she had ever imagined possible. "I do not need a reminder," she said. "I remember every day how lucky I am, how lucky we both are." But she treasured the chest anyway, and it held pride of place in their bedroom for the rest of their lives. Life on the prairie was not always easy. There were droughts that withered the grass and left the cattle thin and thirsty. There were harsh winters when they had to fight to keep the stock alive, breaking ice on the water troughs and hauling feed through deep snow. There were illnesses that swept through, leaving them frightened and exhausted as they nursed sick children back to health. But through it all, Florence and Quinn faced everything together. They had learned to be true partners, supporting each other, loving each other through good times and bad. The practical marriage they had entered into had become something neither of them could have predicted, a deep and abiding love that only grew stronger with time. When Thomas was 10, he started helping Quinn with the ranch work in earnest, learning to rope and brand and all the skills he would need to eventually take over. He was a serious, responsible boy, and Quinn was proud of him in a way that made his chest ache. Lily Rose, at 7, was her mother's shadow, learning embroidery with a natural talent that amazed Florence. Her stitches were already nearly as neat as Florence's had been at twice her age, and she had an eye for color and design that was all her own. James, the wild 5-year-old, was interested in everything and committed to nothing, flitting from one passion to another like a butterfly. One week he wanted to be a cowboy like his father, the next a storekeeper like Mr. Henderson in town, the next a train conductor. Florence and Quinn laughed at his enthusiasm and encouraged all his dreams. On a warm summer evening when Florence was 32 years old, she and Quinn sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The children were inside getting ready for bed, their voices drifting out through the open windows. The ranch stretched out around them, prosperous and peaceful. "You ever think about that day?" Quinn asked, his arm around Florence's shoulders. "The day you knocked on my door." "Sometimes," Florence admitted. "I think about how scared I was, how desperate, how I thought my life was over." "And now," Florence leaned into him, breathing in the familiar smell of leather and soap and the prairie wind that always clung to him. "Now I think it was just beginning. Everything that came before was just the thread. You and me, we are the embroidery, the pattern that makes it all make sense." Quinn kissed the top of her head. "I was so lonely before you came. I did not even realize how lonely until you were here, and suddenly The house felt full. "You brought color into my life, Florence. You brought everything." "We brought it to each other," Florence corrected. "That is what marriage is, I think. Not one person saving the other, but both people creating something new together." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear overhead, countless points of light in the darkening sky. Inside, they heard Lily Rose singing a lullaby to her doll, Thomas reading aloud to James from one of his adventure books. "I want to give you something," Quinn said suddenly. He pulled a small wrapped package from his pocket. "I was going to wait for our anniversary, but I want you to have it now." Florence unwrapped it carefully to find a small portrait, beautifully painted, showing the five of them together. Quinn stood tall in the back, his hands on Thomas's shoulders. Florence sat in front holding James, with Lily Rose beside her. They were all smiling, dressed in their Sunday best. "When did you have this done?" Florence asked, tears filling her eyes. "Last month, when I said I had business in Tulsa. I took that photograph we had made last year to a painter and had him work from that. I wanted us to have something that showed our family, everything we have built together." "It is beautiful," Florence whispered. "We are beautiful." "Yes," Quinn agreed. "We are." The years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their growing children. Thomas fell in love with a rancher's daughter from a neighboring property and married her when he was 21, bringing Florence her first grandchild 2 years later. Lily Rose's embroidery became so renowned that she had to turn down commissions, her work in demand across the country. James, true to his restless nature, became a traveling salesman, sending letters from distant cities full of wild stories and promises to visit soon. Quinn's hair turned gray at the temples, and Florence found silver threads among her blonde. They moved a little slower in the mornings, their joints protesting the years of hard work. But their love remained constant, a steady flame that warmed them both. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party at the ranch. Friends and neighbors came from miles around to celebrate. There was food and music and dancing, and Florence wore a new dress that Lily Rose had embroidered with an intricate pattern of intertwined threads, symbolizing a marriage well stitched. Quinn led her out for a dance under the stars, just as they had danced all those years ago in their small house. He was grayer now, his face lined with age and weather, but to Florence he was just as handsome as the day they met. 25 years, he said, shaking his head in wonder. "Where did they go into this?" Florence said, gesturing at the scene around them. "Their children and grandchildren, the prosperous ranch, the community they were part of, into everything we built." "I would do it all again," Quinn said seriously. "Every moment, every choice, as long as it led me to you, even that first day, even asking a desperate stranger to marry you. Especially that day, because that desperate stranger became my whole world." They danced until the moon rose high overhead, surrounded by love and laughter and the life they had created together. Florence lived to be 67 years old, her hands still nimble with a needle even when arthritis made them ache. She created embroidered blankets for each of her 6 grandchildren, and was working on one for her first great-grandchild when she caught pneumonia one cold February and did not recover. Quinn held her hand through those final days, refusing to leave her bedside. Their children gathered around, and Florence said goodbye to each of them, telling them how proud she was, how much she loved them. To Quinn, she whispered, "Thank you for buying my embroidery. Thank you for all of it." "Thank you for knocking on my door," Quinn whispered back, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Thank you for agreeing to stitch our lives together. It was the greatest honor of my life." Florence smiled, squeezed his hand one last time, and closed her eyes. Quinn lived another 8 years, always keeping Florence's embroidered chest close, running his hands over the carving on the lid when he missed her most. He spent his days with his grandchildren, teaching them to ride and rope and love the land as he did. He never remarried, telling anyone who asked that he had already had the great love of his life and was grateful for every moment of it. When Quinn died peacefully in his sleep at 75, they buried him next to Florence on a hill overlooking the ranch. Their children placed Florence's finest piece of embroidery in his coffin, a scene she had created years ago showing a woman at a door and a man welcoming her in, with their whole life together stitched in the space between them. Thomas inherited the ranch and ran it for many more years before passing it to his own son. Lily Rose's embroidery pieces became collectibles, displayed in museums and galleries. James eventually settled down, bringing his city-raised children to visit the ranch where their father had grown up wild and free. And always, the story was told of how it all began. How a desperate young woman had knocked on a lonely cowboy's door offering embroidered goods, and how he had bought them and asked her to stitch their lives together. How a practical arrangement had become a great love story, proving that sometimes the best things in life come from the chances we take when we have nothing left to lose. The wooden chest Quinn had made for Florence was passed down through generations, each daughter in the family learning embroidery and storing their supplies in it. And on the lid, the carving remained clear and distinct: a woman offering something precious, a man reaching out to receive it, and between them, the beginning of everything. Florence and Quinn's story became a legend in Tulsa, told and retold until it was hard to separate fact from embellishment. But the truth at the heart of it remained constant and clear. Two lonely people had found each other on the Oklahoma prairie, had built a life together stitch by stitch, had loved each other through all the years they were given. They had started with nothing but desperation and loneliness, and had created a legacy of love that lasted long after they were gone. Their great-great-grandchildren still lived on the ranch, still worked the land that Quinn had claimed and Florence had made a home. The house had been expanded and modernized, but the original rooms remained, including the bedroom where Florence had slept that first night as Quinn's bride, scared and uncertain about the future. On the walls throughout the house hung Florence's embroidered pieces, preserved carefully behind glass. Each one told a story of the prairie in bloom, of cattle grazing, of children playing, of a life fully lived. And in the place of honor above the fireplace hung the piece that Florence had been working on the day before she died, finally completed by Lily Rose. It showed two figures, a man and a woman, their hands clasped, threads of every color radiating out from them like light, weaving together into something beautiful and strong and eternal. That piece was titled, in tiny embroidered letters at the bottom, "The Stitching of Lives." It was the story of Quinn and Florence Fitzgerald, who had met as strangers and become soulmates, who had taken a chance on each other when they had every reason not to, and who had proven that love could grow in the most unlikely places if it was tended with care, honesty, and faith. Their story lived on in the land they had worked, in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren they had created, in the embroidery that survived them, beautiful and intricate and strong. It lived on in the memories of those who had known them, and in the legend passed down through generations. And it began, always, with a knock on a door, a carpetbag full of embroidered linens, and a lonely cowboy who saw beyond the desperation in a young woman's eyes to the strength and beauty underneath. He had bought her embroidery, yes, but more importantly, he had offered her a home, a partnership, and eventually a love that transformed them both. She had come to offer embroidery. He had bought it and asked her to stitch their lives together. And from those simple threads, they had created something extraordinary, a tapestry of love that would last forever, bright and beautiful and true. The pattern they wove together in their years as husband and wife became the foundation for generations to come. Each stitch a testament to the power of taking chances, of seeing potential in the most desperate circumstances, of believing that love can be found even when you are not looking for it. In the end, Florence and Quinn's marriage was not just a convenient arrangement that grew into affection. It was a masterpiece, carefully crafted by two people who understood that the best things in life require patience, dedication, and the willingness to pick up the needle again, even when your fingers are tired and the pattern seems impossible. They stitched their lives together one day at a time, one conversation at a time, one shared laugh and shared sorrow at a time, until the seams between them disappeared entirely and they became one beautiful, complete whole. And so their story ended not with sadness but with satisfaction, not with regret but with fulfillment, not with an ending at all but with a continuation, their love living on in everyone they had touched, as permanent and beautiful as the finest embroidery, stitched with care into the fabric of the world they had helped create.